Dr. Buras is my sweet mate. He's somebody else's sweet mate, but we share a wall between our offices, which means that he doesn't have much protection against my interruption, but it also means sometimes we can carry on conversation without hardly having to pause work. And one of the great things about coming to Baylor is having such great colleagues in other departments who know different things than what I know and have different gifts and talents than what I have, and we've seen a lot of those on display today. But another great thing about coming to Baylor is having such great colleagues within my department, indeed, to share a wall with people who are able to always teach me something and to be engaged with and to have on a daily basis the kind of conversation that a philosopher lives for. And so please welcome my colleague and sweet mate, Dr. Todd Buras.
So I've got the anchor leg of a fairly long race, and I understand that the anchor is supposed to go fast. So I'll try to keep things moving at a pretty good clip. I commend you folks for your endurance today and look forward to your response to my own paper. I also want to say very briefly, before I get started in the race, what an honor it is to share the stage with such distinguished colleagues here at Baylor and from abroad. Dr. Wielenberg, our guest. I do have one small thing against my colleagues, a gentle correction to be sure, except for Dr. Scott Moore's exceedingly subtle tie. You folks might have known that today was an occasion to celebrate the 50th anniversary of C.S. Lewis's death, but you might not have known that today is the day to celebrate something for which it's undoubtedly going to be known in the Baylor undergrad population for much longer. It's the day in which an epic beatdown happens at Oklahoma State. So to compensate for their failure, I've worn the biggest and brightest Baylor colors I could find. So, I'll be discussing C.S. Lewis's reflections on the significance of a certain sort of experience. It's an experience of intense desire, longing really, which is elicited but not satisfied by the glories of the world. And since my topic is so, don't know how to say it, maybe numinous, I think it will be helpful to have an example of the relevant sort of experience clearly in view right from the start. And so at great risk to my own reputation as a argumentative philosopher, I'd like to start my presentation with a poem. But just in case you literary scholars are worried, I'm not going to conclude the reading of the poem with a therefore or any such thing as that, so I will try to do it justice. Poetry is really the only sort of language suited to describe the kind of thing Lewis is after, and so it seems doubly fitting to begin with a poem. The one I've chosen is on the handout. I hope you have a copy by now, or at least can look on. The name of the poem is Hamlin Brook by Richard Wilbur. In order to get a lot out of the one reading of the poem, it's the sort of poem you should read many, many times, but in order to get a lot out of the reading of the poem, I thought I should say a few things to set it up. What happens in this poem is basically a man leans to drink from a stream after work and sees in the stream the beauty of what's going on under it in the presence of a fish, the beauty of its own surface, and then the beauty of what's reflected above him behind his shoulders in the depth that's represented in the reflection. So, you can read it there with me. At the alder-darkened brink, where the stream slows to a lucid jet, I lean to the water, denting its top with sweat, and see, before I can drink, a startled inchling trout of spotted near transparency, troweling a shadow solider than he. He swerves now, darting out to where, in a flicked slough of sparks and glittering silt, he weaves through streambed rocks, disturbing foundered leaves, and butts then out of view. Beneath a sliding glass, crazed by the skimming of a brace of burnished dragonflies across its face, in which deep cloudlets pass, and a white precipice of mirrored birch trees plunges down toward where the azures of the zenith drown. How shall I drink all this? Joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck, also with an ache nothing can satisfy. I have no doubt that Wilbur had Lewis's reflections in mind, reflections on joy in mind when he wrote this poem. But Lewis took such experiences, the sort recounted here in this moment of poetry, with the utmost seriousness. And he had a lot to say about their content and significance. Reflection on such desires and longings, they feature prominently in his own conversion story as recounted in Surprised by Joy. Such experiences also make an appearance in his apologetic writings, Mere Christianity and the Problem of Pain. They both receive a chapter. They also figure as themes in the fictional writing for which Lewis is most well known. The Pilgrim's Regress comes to mind, and I am told by sharper minds than my own when it comes to the reading of literature that it's quite a pervasive theme and especially prominent in Until We Have Faces. But most notably, I think the subject of these experiences is the explicit subject and treated, as it were, in one full swath in The Weight of Glory, a sermon that's already been mentioned here today several times. Now, I think I'm going to suggest that Lewis was basically right to take these experiences very seriously, though I will be quibbling a bit with the way in which he unpacks their significance. And part of what I want to do is offer my own way of getting at what's so important about these moments. To see how Lewis understood these experiences and reasoned about them, I'll turn far too briefly, to his own words. I want you to hear his own thoughts about them. And we'll be drawing exclusively from The Weight of Glory, which to my mind is the most complete presentation of his thought on the subject. The main point is really to establish that these experiences are, as he says, the truest index of our real situation. So Lewis is interested in a desire whose object is simultaneously ubiquitous and elusive. There's a sense in which he thinks, in desiring anything at all, we also have a desire for something more, which is not satisfied when we attain the objects of our initial desires. So see quote 1 in section 2 to hear him express this in his own words. The books or music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trusted them. It is not in them, it only came through them. And what comes through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire, but if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never visited. End of the quote. Typically, Lewis leaves the object of these desires almost completely uncharacterized, except in these purely negative terms, that is, a desire no earthly good can satisfy. But in The Weight of Glory, Lewis risks shedding a bit more light on the subject with biblical imagery. Our sacred books, he says, give some account of the object of our deepest longing in terms that initially he himself finds quite off-putting, but unpacks in quite a beautiful way in terms of glory. That is, good favor or renown with God. See quote 2. The sense that in this universe we are treated as strangers, the longing to be acknowledged, to meet with some response, to bridge some chasm that yawns between us and reality, is part of our inconsolable secret. That is our deepest longing. And surely from this point of view, the promise of glory, in the sense described, becomes highly relevant to our deep desire. For glory meant good report with God, acceptance by God, response, acknowledgement, and welcome into the heart of things. The door on which we have been knocking all our lives will open at last. End of quote. Now, Lewis has a lot more to say about glory than just this point, that it involves a certain kind of renown or acknowledgement or recognition by God. It also means something like union with the things that shimmer and shine and coruscate with God's own glory. And so the desire, this deep longing, is a lot like love in certain respect. It involves a certain kind of aspiration to union with the object desired. But I'm going to pass over these subtler points about the concept of glory. The key point for my purposes is that the object of desire that interests Lewis so much is possible only if there is a God. Plain old renown is not the goal. It would be like the dumb idols that ultimately break our hearts. In any case, Lewis realizes that merely establishing some fact about human psychology, that we desire transcendent glory, some transcendent goods like glory, that shows very little about the rest of reality, that is, reality outside our minds. We also have obscure fears of the dark. That doesn't tell us a lot about our true situation. We human beings are subject to all sorts of idiosyncratic psychological predilections, and nonetheless, Lewis believes that our deep desire for some transcendent good is no neurotic fancy, I'm quoting here, no neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. And he attempts to establish this point by reasoning as follows. You'll see quote 3 for this. We remain conscious of a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. But is there any reason to suppose that reality offers any satisfaction to it? And here he's imagining someone answering. Nor does the being hungry prove that we have bread. But I think it may be urged that this misses the point. A man's physical hunger does not prove that that man will get any bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic. But surely a man's hunger does prove that he comes from a race which repairs its body by eating and inhabits a world where edible substances exist. In the same way, though I do not believe, I wish I did, that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it, I think it is a pretty good indication that such a thing exists and some men will. End of quote. So Lewis's reasoning seems to be something like this. Our natural desires tell us something about the sort of creature we are and the sort of world we inhabit. There's obviously some looseness of fit between the natural desire for some state of affairs and the way the world really is. Indeed, the whole point of our desires is not to represent the way the world really is, but to represent it as it is not quite, but might be. But there's not so much looseness between the objects of our desires and the way the world is that we might be subject to natural desires that are, strictly speaking, unsatisfiable. If this were the case, our natural desires would be in vain. They would send us looking and searching for objects that are simply not to be found. We would, I suppose, in this case, be like a person who had a strange fear of triangles. I mean, the fear of the dark, you can sort of see how, while that's not a perfectly accurate index of our true situation, does give us some helpful information about our true condition, whereas a fear of triangles would just be absurd. It wouldn't index anything accurate about us. So, if, on the other hand, natural desires are satisfiable, then that's going to tell us something about the way the world is. The world contains the sort of things that our desires send us in search of. So human beings have a natural desire that sends us in search of states of affairs that are possible only if there's a God. That, I think Lewis's reasoning, is a pretty good indication that such things exist. So I think Lewis is on to something really important, and though I grant at the outset that his reasoning can be, and I'm afraid has been, and it's no small part due to his own way of putting things, has been expressed in what I think are obviously unsound arguments, rather than spending my time rehearsing the flaws of the unsound summaries of this line of reasoning, I'll try to instead to present what I take to be the best version of the argument for a desire, or something I think is not doing violence to what Lewis is getting at, but is not exactly what he said. So as I see it, the argument here contains two central claims. One claim is that our natural desires index something about reality, and the second claim is that we desire some state of affairs for which the existence of God is a necessary condition. Now, I agree with Lewis that our desires tell us something about the way the world is. They index something about our true situation, as he says. But I would be more careful than he was in identifying what it is that our natural desires show us about the way the world is. In most passages, Lewis seems ready to jump straight from a claim about what we desire to a claim about what exists. That the world contains the sorts of things that would fulfill our desires. I think they tell us rather about the possibility of objects that would satisfy our desires. And by asking the argument from desire to deliver less, that is, to prove something is possible as opposed to something is actual, I hope to convince you by the end of my time here that it actually delivers more. So beliefs and desires are both intentional mental states. They earn their keep in our cognitive life by representing the world as being a certain way. Now, when beliefs represent the way the world is, we call them true. And when a desire represents the way, when the world comes to be the way our desires represent it, we call those desires fulfilled. Now, some beliefs are not only false, but they are necessarily false, and we call those absurd. Just so, some desires are not only unfulfilled, but necessarily unfulfilled, and we would call those vain. The way absurd beliefs and vain desires represent the world being is just simply not a way the world could be. Think of believing that there's a round square cupola over on Patton F. Hall there, or desiring that there should be one. Those are just not representations of the way the world could be, because nothing could be both round and square. So according to this way of regimenting the terminology then, to say a desire is not in vain is just to say that it has a possible state of affairs as its object. A non-vain desire represents the way the world might be, might come to be. So to call a desire natural, as opposed to calling it non-vain, there's a very long tradition of reflection on natural desire. I'm going to do incredible violence to it to move over it so fast, but let me just say this. I think to call a desire natural means at a minimum that the desire does the job nature assigns to desires. And the role of desires is pretty straightforward. There's not much disagreement about it. The role of desires in the cognitive economy is to guide human action or give us reasons to do things, to rationalize the things we do. So the job of our beliefs is to represent things how things are, and the job of our desires is to represent the way they might be. And together, beliefs and desires enable us to exercise agency, to act deliberately in a way that changes the world from the way it is to the way it might be. So a desire can guide action. That is, it can lead you to do some things that fulfill the desire or bring the desire closer to fulfillment. That is, it can only guide your action if it directs you towards some steps that either fulfill your desire or bring it closer to fulfillment. Vain desires for impossible objects, cannot be fulfilled or brought closer to fulfillment by any series of actions you might take. So vain desires can't guide action. They can't do the job nature assigns. They are therefore not natural. And hence, I think we can say with some confidence, no natural desires are in vain. So very quickly, here's what I imagine. Suppose you had an intense desire to build a round square picture frame, let's say, and I put on the table in front of you hammer, nail, and bits of molding and said, okay, follow your desire where it leads. Build one. There is quite literally no step that it would direct you to, or to put it more accurately, it actually would lead you, every step it would lead you to, it would also lead you not to do. So there's nothing it would lead you to do. It would lead you sort of without a guide. There's nothing you could do that would bring it closer to fulfillment. So that's the thought. There's a big objection to this way of understanding what our natural desires tell us to do about reality, but my aim at this point is to simply formulate the argument. There'll be time for you folks to knock it down after I have set it up. So for now, I just want to note what follows. A natural, that is an action-guiding desire for some state of affairs, proves not that the state of affairs exists, but that the desired state of affairs is possible. That is, it's the sort of thing that might exist. A natural desire for some state of affairs tells us not only that the desired state is possible, but it tells us that anything that is necessary for that desired state to come about is possible too. So if some state of affairs is possible, then all the things that are necessary for that state of affairs to obtain are going to be possible too. So the second main point that I think Lewis really got right, that's the point on which I would have been more careful than Lewis was. The second main point I think he got exactly right is that human beings naturally desire some states of affairs for which the existence of God is a necessary condition. Actually, I think human beings desire several such states of affairs, and part of what I do in a much longer version of this paper is to unpack a couple of examples. But to keep the conversation moving here, I am, after all, on the anchor leg. Let's stick with Lewis's example of glory, where that connotes some sort of ultimate cosmic divine approval, acknowledgement that one has made a contribution in the widest possible context of value, the most ultimate possible context of value. Now, the argument works, I suppose, even if there's only one person who in fact desires glory, and I'm tempted to take a shortcut here and just say human beings desire glory. I'll take one for the team and say I'm the guy who does. But there is at least one more substantive thing I can say about why it would be true that human beings, how I could defend the premise that human beings desire naturally desire states of affairs for which the existence of God is a necessary condition. And the point here draws on another way in which beliefs are like desires. So let me spell this out very quickly. Some propositions, like the law of non-contradiction, they're self-evident, we say. Simply understanding the terms of the self-evident proposition compels assent. The best reason to believe a self-evident proposition is simply an exposition of the content of the concepts involved. If more reason is needed or demanded, it's really difficult or impossible to satisfy the demand because there's nothing more evident that we may appeal to in order to support self-evident propositions. So none of this is to say that a belief in a self-evident proposition is strictly speaking incorrigible. With effort, we might withhold assent from such propositions, but such beliefs are what I would think we might more accurately call intractable. That is, without constant vigilance, belief in self-evident propositions inevitably insinuates itself into our belief system, our noetic structure, as they say. So I think there's something similar on the side of desire. I think there are what I might call intrinsically desirable states of affairs, and they're the connotative counterpart of self-evident propositions. Simply understanding the elements of some states of affairs compels desire. There's just nothing more desirable to which we might appeal in order to motivate desire for such states of affairs. Desires for intrinsically desirable states of affairs, while not altogether incorrigible, they would be intractable. They would be the sorts of things that you would have to work to eradicate from the structure of your desires, and they would sort of constantly be threatening to creep back in without vigilance. The desire for happiness might be something like this. I mean, it's just hard to suppress it. So consider now Lewis's example of being greeted at the end of earthly life with the words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter now into your master's rest." Anyone who says, "No thanks, I'll pass on that," seems simply not to get it in the way we might say that anyone who rejects a self-evident proposition just seems not to get it. We could go on multiplying examples here, but consider also the possibility that's possible, I think, only if there's a God, that all suffering is ultimately redeemed, defeated even. I think, again, I would say that's an intrinsically desirable state of affairs and would lead you to a lifetime of action that might promote that goal, but that goal would ultimately only be possible if there is a God. So one of the remarkable things about God, I think, is that the sorts of things that are possible only if He exists are all extremely desirable things. There's nothing that we really deeply desire, I think, I'll risk saying, though I know it may come up in Q&A, nothing we intrinsically desire for which the existence of God, the non-existence of God, would be required. So let's take stock. If no natural desire is in vain, and human beings have a natural desire for some state of affairs for which the existence of God is a necessary condition, what follows? Well, it follows that the existence of God is possible. That result may seem a bit of a letdown now. You might have thought, wasn't Lewis's goal to find a pretty good indication that God exists and not just that God's existence is possible? Right. That was his goal. But here's the thing. When it comes to the existence of God, it's pretty widely accepted now among atheist and theist philosophers of religion that establishing the possibility of God's existence comes to the same thing as establishing God's existence. There's a very short argument here, actually a very long argument here that would take a long time to unpack, but I'll give you the short version. God is the sort of thing that either exists in every possible world or in none. So if you prove that God's existence is possible, you show that God exists in one possible world. This means that it's not the case that God exists in none of the possible worlds. And from this it follows that He exists in all of them. The actual world is a possible world, so it follows that He exists in the actual world. So it follows that He exists. So I realize there's a lot going on there, and that may be something I need to do a better job explaining. But on this way of understanding the argument from desire, natural desires do not tell us directly about what exists, as Lewis sometimes seems to have said. Rather, they tell us about what's possible. And since in God's case, establishing the possibility and actuality come to the same thing, natural desires indirectly tell us about what exists, about God's existence. Hence, by asking the argument from desire to deliver more, a possibility instead of an actuality, I actually think it delivers more. Now, I should pause here and should have said at the outset, the argument that I have just recounted to you, this version of the argument from desire that I've presented in section 2 of the paper, is something that I worked on for a long time. I have a longer version of the paper, which I co-authored with a former grad student named Mike Cantrell. So the line of reasoning you've just heard summarized there is not entirely my own. So, in philosophy, we say it first and then take it back. Now, we say it first and then defend it or qualify it if we must. So, I've said it. And we normally get through this business of qualifying or taking it back to some degree through a consideration of objections and replies. And in the interest of time here, since I think I'm coming on my mark of time, I think I only want to concentrate on one of the objections, which is the third. I have 3 on the handout there. But in order to set up the third objection, I want to say a few words about the second. So consider the desire. Here's what appears to be a desire for a vain object that appears to guide action. So consider the desire to compile a Russellian reference work. This is under the heading of Vain Desires Guide Action in Part 3. A Russellian reference work is just well, you'll see. It's a reference work that cites all and only reference works that don't cite themselves. Now, the ultimate object of this desire is, strictly speaking, impossible. No one could ever write such a reference work because the reference work would both have to cite itself and not cite itself if it was to include all and only reference works that don't cite themselves. So, yet it seems that, so there's a good example of an impossible object, but yet it seems that such a desire might guide a lifetime's worth of work. You might, spend your days troweling through the bottoms, the dark corners of libraries, looking for reference works that don't cite themselves and making large lists of them. So I think what I want to say about that case is that desire for vain objects, technically speaking, I don't think that shows that desire for vain objects guide action, since I don't think that there's anything that actually brings that goal closer to fulfillment or would ever fulfill it. Yet the vain desire will seem to guide action. So I want to grant that vain desires can seem to guide action. And they seem to guide action by including possible states of affairs as components of their ultimate object. And so just as one who desires to compile a Russellian reference work desires, for instance, to compile a reference work, and that's a possible object, thus the desire for a possible object could lead him to a lifetime of action there. The vain desire will seem to guide action only if it contains a possible state of affairs as a component. And in this case, I say it's not the vain desire, the desire for a vain object or an impossible object isn't guiding action. Technically speaking, it's only seeming to do so. And so the objection that really gives me pause, and here I think there's a lot to think about, is whether the desire for the states of affairs that involve God would be like that. Perhaps the state of affairs of achieving renown with God or glory leads you to a life of action that nonetheless has an impossible state of affairs as its ultimate object, but since it leads you to do things like acquire renown in your immediate circle, it seems to guide action, though it doesn't ultimately do so. And the only thing I'd like to say about that, by way of taking it back a bit or qualifying what I've said, is I do think I would say this: we have no reason to think that to be so. In the Russellian reference work case, I can tell you what it is about the object that makes it impossible. We have a reason, ultimately, to see that it's impossible. And I don't think we have any reason, independently of antecedent commitment to atheism, to take our desires for God-involving states of affairs to have implicitly contradictory objects. And so while I can't say anything that rules it out, I think it does saddle atheism with a slight, maybe something that the old atheists used to like to say, but is not so commonly embraced today, which is a sort of absurd view of human life, that an absurd view of human life would follow if it turns out that the states of affairs we most deeply desire and that guide our action in the most fundamental ways turn out to have impossible states of affairs as objects. It would be a kind of absurd view of human life, I think, because, like I said, the states of affairs that we imagine, the ultimate defeat of evil or ultimate glory of the sort Lewis described, are intrinsically desirable things. It would be hard. It would take a lifetime of really hard work to suppress those desires, so they will inevitably be creeping back in. And that's a sort of absurd view of human life. So that's the best I can say in response to the most serious objection, and the closest I come, I suppose, to taking it back. So I have flown through quite a lot of ground of an argument inspired by Lewis. I realize it's late and that you're probably already wondering how the warm-up is going in Oklahoma State. I can assure you it's going very well, yes. So let me end there and invite questions.
Since this is the last session, real quick, I want to thank all of our contributors. Dr. Wood, who has shown uncanny endurance. He attended last night's event, and he got here first thing this morning and has been here through all of the sessions and asked questions in many of them, and asked questions that are very insightful and vigorous in many of them. My colleague, Dr. Beckwith, Dr. Wielenberg, of course, for joining us. He got in Wednesday night and has done 6 different events for us. That's really working him to death. Dr. Jacobs for coming in his first semester here. Dr. Jeffrey for taking time out of his insanely busy schedule. Doctors Weaver, Moore, and Henry for accepting my invitation to come up with their own idea for what to present. I just wanted all of them to work together, and that's exactly what they did. And finally, Dr. Buras, I really appreciate your guys coming out and making this thing happen. So thank you, guys. I also want to thank all of you for coming. And some of you have shown a great deal of endurance, too. We've gotten a lot of ideas in a short time. I am a fairly frenetic and overactive person. 6 sessions in one day was ambitious, but with the grace and eloquence of our speakers and your endurance, I think it's worked out wonderfully. And the idea is to take it all in, and then it's like a time-release capsule. And so you may not be able to process it all today, but the idea is to get a discussion going on campus and throughout Texas and the areas where people have come from, to keep that conversation going way after the conference. I'd also like to start by asking the first question, and then Eric, just because it pertains to the very last thing you said. So you gave 2 examples of impossible states of affairs that might seem to guide action, but couldn't. You couldn't. If you said, my goal is to build a round square rotunda, okay, go. There's nothing you could do. I mean, maybe that's not exactly right, because I'll go to the store and buy some wood. So that's step 1, but you couldn't do much past that. With the Russellian dictionary, you can't even get started on that one. But what about this impossible state of affairs? Counting to infinity. That's something that you just can't do. In fact, there might even be, after you unpack the concepts, it might even be contradictory. But it seems like it's something that could guide your actions. In fact, it could guide your actions indefinitely. So I just wanted to start out by asking the first question, and then I'll look around and get the cue.
So before I forget, I think we should also take a moment to thank Dr. Doherty for spearheading this and for presenting a fantastic talk of his own. So it's been delightful to see this occasion unfold, and I'm very honored to be a part of it. So I think the thing I want to say about that is pretty much just what I said about the other cases of impossible objects. So I'm not sure that you're going to that I'm going to say anything that really changes things. So maybe I'm not appreciating the force of the objection, but I think that that impossible state of affairs of counting to infinity, I'll grant that you couldn't do it. In fact, I'm certain you couldn't do it. And anyone who ever says they've done it, you should doubt. They say, whew, I just finished. Got to the last number. Yeah. Yeah. So I think what I want to say about that is that it has a possible state of affairs as a proper part. So the impossible state of affairs of counting to infinity has a possible state of affairs as a proper part, which would be counting to a very high finite number. And so that could guide your action. And it's only that gets you going. Technically speaking, nothing you've done all along, after you've counted, let's imagine just for millennia, after you've counted, has gotten you any closer to fulfilling your original desire. So the way I want to think about whether or not a desire guides action is whether anything you could do could fulfill it or bring it any closer to fulfillment. And technically speaking, I don't think even after you've counted to a very large finite number, you've even brought it even any closer to fulfillment. So it remains as unfulfilled as it ever was, and as unfulfilled as it and as unfulfillable as it could be. So I'm not sure I've said anything that would satisfy you, but that's it. So you want to summarize the questions? Yeah. Eric? That way I can think about the answer.
Thanks. You finished on this note of intrinsic desirability, so spelling out a particular vision of what's intrinsically desirable. I want to ask about the extent to which your argument depends on this concept of natural. So channeling my friends and colleagues in the anthropology of religion, depending on how you cash out the sort of phenomenology of desire, it seems like this desire for a particular God that you spelled out, one who will, a univocal God, a unitary God, who is going to right wrongs, defeat suffering, welcome you into eternal rest, that's actually going to be historically and culturally delineated. In fact, it's going to leave out billions of human beings who don't have, by all appearances, according to anthropologists, do not have such a desire. So I guess it's a question about both the sort of intrinsic desirability of the vision that you were spelling out and what it means to be natural, given that it seems like this is sort of culturally situated.
So it sounds like the question is something like this. Haven't you invoked a concept of God that is so narrowly construed to a particular cultural milieu that it can't be natural?
Just less than universally, and less than universally.
So the question is, isn't it the case that to count as natural, it would have to be universally desired? And since it's not universally desired, it can't count as natural. Is that the...
It's a suggestion about what natural means, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. I appreciate it. In the longer versions of the paper, I have stuff to say about it. So I'll try to just summarize what I think are the main points to make. One of the flaws, I think, of some other versions of the argument from desire is that it assumes a natural desire is universal. I do not assume that. I think I'll not say why right off. But But this I do want to say. I was very careful to state the object of desire, and as I think Lewis is, very careful to state that the object of desire isn't exactly a desire for God or even union with God. It's a desire for something that's possible only if there is a God. And I think that could be more broadly shared than it may seem. A desire for justice, ultimate justice, or the Kantian summum bonum. But the key thing for me is not how actually widely shared the desire is, but whether or not it is intrinsically desirable. And I think you let me sit down and talk with whomever it is you think doesn't desire this state of affairs, and I get a chance to describe it to them, and I say, now, what would you not like about that? Wouldn't you think that's worth going for? And I think if they say yes, then I got what I want. Is that making any sense? So that's how I would go about it. Just a first key thing, I suppose, is to distinguish it as something's being natural from its being universal.
Josh and then John. Oh, Josh and then Allie and then John.
So there's a number of people working in the cognitive science of religion who give explanations for why humans have a sort of disposition in general to believe in or find plausible at least some notion of a God, sort of
So let's try to encapsulate that a little bit. Is the question, isn't it the case that if we had a scientific explanation as to why we had this desire, then the presence of that scientific explanation as to why we have this desire would show that the desire does not track possibility? Is that how it goes?
No. So if we had this scientific explanation for why we had this desire and that explanation didn't appeal to there being a God, then wouldn't that explanation indicate that we could well have that desire whether or not the object really is possible? So it's not that it shows that we do have the desire even though it's not possible, but that we might have the desire even though it's not possible.
So the question is, what if we have a scientific explanation of why we have the desire that makes no reference to God, that is a totally non-God involving explanation of why we have the desire? Doesn't that show that we could have the desire even if there's no God?
So, good question, thank you. I think, no, it shows how creative our explanations might be, or how misguided our explanations might be. And to be short, just to keep things moving here, I think that there's nothing about having a naturalistic explanation of religious belief or religious desire that indicates that they're not truth tracking and indexing something about our real situation. In fact, I think that if there is a God, you might expect something like a natural impulse to believe or a natural impulse to respond, to go after those things that lead us to God, to find appealing those sorts of things. I think a natural impulse toward those sorts of mental states would be what you would expect if there's a God. And it's as it were, a common grace. And in this regard, I'm really appealing to some moves that are really quite common among theistic philosophers when they deal with these arguments from the cognitive sciences of religion. But I want to especially note that I'm borrowing straight from my colleague Steve Evans' book on natural signs and knowledge of God, in which he thinks that such impulses to believe, or in our case, it would be an impulse to desire. The fact that there's a naturalistic explanation of those and some scientific story that could be told about them doesn't indicate anything about whether they're truth tracking. So,
Allie? Okay, so the suggestion is that the first premise is that natural desires are a guide to possibility. And it turns out that it looks like it's maybe true by definition, or if you try to provide a counterexample to that, it simply can't guide action unless it's possibly completable. And so the thing that is appealed to in defending the premise basically includes the premise as part of it. Is that essentially the idea? Okay.
So nice question, Allie. I think there's no doubt about that, but that's just a feature that I think is unavoidable and not really a problem. I mean, the argument, every valid argument is like this in a way. So the question, which is to say that the premises couldn't be true unless the conclusion is also true. The question is really whether or not there's enough distance between the premises and conclusions. So, and on that matter, I'm not sure. I just have to I mean, part of what's interesting about the premises is it appeals to the fact that you naturally desire some object, some state of affairs. You're drawn to it, and when I ask you what, when we talk about what that means, I say, well, it leads you towards a pattern of action that's aimed at fulfilling the desire. And yeah, it turns out that, and from that, I try to reason that shows that God's existence is possible. It turns out that, of course, if God's existence is not possible, then all that action guiding was only an appearance of action guiding. So I think that there is circularity here, but it's the typical kind that follows from valid deductive arguments. So the real question is just whether or not I start by appealing to things that are sufficiently far removed from the conclusion so that I'm not just restating the conclusion. Sorry, restating the premise and the conclusion. And that's, so maybe you think I'm not.
Okay, we only have time for one question. That last question goes to John Giannini.
So I think in 3.1, you're giving a somewhat stipulative definition of what it is for desire to be natural. And to evaluate whether a desire is natural, it looks like we have to already know whether its object is possible. And that's how you dismiss some of the objections, was by saying we already know that object to be impossible. And because we recognize that, we can see that you can't really draw near to it, even if it seems to be a big law. So my question about your whole argument is, how could we ever gain evidential support for the claim that some desire was natural, which we would need for this to provide any support for the existence of God? We need a specific desire that would not be fulfillable without the existence of God to be shown to be natural. How can we support that without presuming God's existence?
Okay, so this is basically a different kind of circularity worry, or an extension of Ali's circularity worry. He says that your definition of natural desire is stipulative. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I hope so.
And then that creates problems for getting evidence for that.
I don't have an issue with it being stipulative,
I know.
but rather, were it defined the way we normally use it, a desire being widespread and occurring naturally would seem to be enough. But it's not, given your definition.
Given the definition, the sorts of things that we would naturally take to be evidence for naturalness, being widespread, being innate, turn out not to count as evidence for it.
Yeah. So, more good questions, thank you. And, I'm not sure I'll have decisive knockdown response for this, but, here's the way I think it goes. So, say, look, consider the Kantian sunum bonum, which I think Kant is right, is probably possible only if there's a God. And you ask yourself, is that worth working for? The ultimate convergence of virtue and happiness. And you think, or the ultimate defeat of evils. You think, yeah, that really is awesome. I mean, nothing would be better, really, than that. And does it direct me towards some action? Yeah, it directs me towards a life of a certain kind of moral effort, focused on eliminating injustice and so forth. And so you start down that path. And do you see any reason this would not be fulfillable? Well, I mean, your point is that, well, if God doesn't exist, then the ultimate part of it is unfulfillable, right? Yeah, but that just looks to me to say I'm engaged on a course of action that seems entirely possible to me if the universe is such that it cooperates appropriately. And I have no reason to think it doesn't. So that looks to me like, so far, it looks natural, even without any appeal to it being innate or universal. I mean...
All right. Much food for thought today. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful